I'm going to show you a demo on how to use the Problem Formulator tool. After you go to the home page, you go and click on Login and enter your username and password. We click on Login. It takes us to the window that has all the problem maps. Now we can add a new problem map by clicking on the Add New Problem Map button. Here we have to give our problem map a name and a description. Okay, takes us back to where we have all the problem maps, but as you can see, the problem map is now created. We click on the newly added problem map. This is the main user interface of the problem map tool. As you can see, we have 5 different columns for 5 different groups of entities. We can start by adding an entity. Let's suppose that we were given a problem statement and it had a few requirements that we want to add, like the design should be a mechanical device. We can add the requirement either by pressing the plus button, or for the next requirement, sample fresh water, just pressing enter. Then we can add the next one, depth up to 500 meters. Not attached, we can go back, attached to boat after release. You can see that we can have long textual descriptions for any of these entities. Easily adjustable in 10-meter increments. I can add any entity to any of these groups at any time. Let's say I think about my device having a sampling compartment. Maybe I can use some weights to get it down. I can also add functions. Let's say I want my device to descend, sample water, and then ascend. Now let's see how we can create a functional decomposition. We want to add more children to these nodes, decompose them further. I want to suppose add a few functions to sample water. I first have to add them. Say open valve, flow water, and close valve. Now in order to add these 3 functions to sample water as its children, I should take this one, click on it, drag it on sample water. Once I see it's in there, the triangle, I drop it. Can do similarly for flow water. Now it's inside sample water, goes there, open valve, sample water, drop. Now I have a patterned sample water which has these 3 children. I can decompose further. Let's say I want to add measure depth and trigger valve to open valve. I add them again, drag and drop, measure depth to open valve. It's inside open valve. Trigger valve inside open valve. Now, sample water had those three, open valve had these two. So the function should descend, sample water and ascend, and sample water, open valve, flow water, close valve, and open valve is trigger valve, measure depth. I can edit any of these entities by clicking on them and adding new text, like I changed this not attached to boat after release to standalone. Similarly, I edit this sample freshwater, be more specific, and say sample half-liter freshwater. Now let's relate to entities. We can do that easily by dragging and dropping, similar to how we added children to parents. Let's say I want to relate this function, measure depth, to easily adjustable in 10-meter increments. I drag and drop. Now these two are related. They both light up together, showing that they're connected. I can now add more details. I say that probably I need a pressure gauge for that measure depth function. And since this device is going to work in depth and water, hydrostatic pressure, formula applies. It has a few parameters. I'm going to add them, rho, h, and g. In the same way that I added children to parents, I can here drop these parameters to the hydrostatic pressure formula or law. It's a bit tricky. Okay, dragged and dropped. I can relate this behavior to pressure gauge artifact, to this function, measure depth. I also think that this relates to this requirement, depth up to 500 meters, and then I realized that that may cause a very high pressure, which worries me, and I had this issue that withstanding pressure in that depth is going to be a challenge. I can add this issue to this requirement and to this behavior. The good thing about the tool is that I can add anything at any time and relate things at different orders. Well, I had this pressure gauge added. Well, I think instead of a pressure gauge, why not use a depth gauge and consider a pressure gauge a type of a depth gauge? Well, considering that, I put this under depth gauge. We can also create a disjunctive decomposition. Let's say that we want to use a different depth gauge instead of pressure gauge. First we have to collapse this, double click on it, close this folder. Now we can add a new artifact. An artifact could be, it doesn't need to be just a component or part, it can be a description of a solution principle or a concept, like a sensor that determines depth based on how dark water is in a specific depth. interesting solution. Now we can drag and drop this to depth gauge. Now you see we have now two different compositions, two different decompositions. When we have different decompositions, we can choose to see one of them at any time. First, we have to close that decomposition, double click on the folder, double click again, and then you can choose one of them, one of the branches to appear. As you saw, long texts are allowed. We can define descriptions of issues like light intensity, changes at different times of the day or year. That's the issue that we have with this sensor. Now they're related. We can remove entities and relations between them. To remove an entity, we should click on the delete button and saying OK deletes the entity. To remove relations, we should right click on the entity and delete the links, like here, delete link to measure depth. So it's no longer related to measure depth function, it's only related to the requirement depth up to 500 meters. We can also view our problem map in a graph mode. Click View as Graph, and you see a tree-like list of all the entities. We can see different decompositions that we created in this fashion.